Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us in our Frolic on the St. John's Symposium this year, 2022. We'd like to welcome you to Westminster Hall. And on behalf of the First Presbyterian Church and the Bartram Trail Society of Florida, welcome to an afternoon of presentations. I guarantee you're going to be impressed with what you hear today. And it's going to be in a little different direction than what the last 2 or 3 days of the Frolic has been about. So you're going to learn quite a bit from all of our speakers here this afternoon. A few announcements. You may notice a very specially decorated table back there. We'd like to thank BJ Johns right here and Susie Cornelio with the First Presbyterian Church. They did an amazing job indeed. So feel free at any time to grab some snacks back there and refreshments. There's also a birthday cake there because my birthday was April 20th. 283 years old, I might add. Well, thank you. And I will tell you, the secret is that fountain of youth over at St. Augustine. Yep, that sulfur water is amazing. So I would recommend consume as much of that as you possibly can. Also, there's a restroom down this hallway to the right if you need to use the restroom at any time. And I believe Sam Carr, the president of the Bartram Trail Society of Florida, would like to say a few words, and we'll get started with our program this afternoon. Again, thanks for joining us and enjoy the symposium.
Thanks everybody for being here. This is our 7th symposium. It really is. And so this started us out with the Bartram Trail in Bucks County way back in 2014 when we had our very first one, and it was quite memorable. And because we didn't think that anybody cared, because we didn't know who Billy Bartram was till scholars showed up and told us, and I just imagine the shock on our face when we said it really happened here, and that's how the Bartram Trail in Bucks County started. Actually, was in a symposium like this. I remember Dean Campbell and I laughing at each other, in the first symposium because we couldn't believe it. And just as it was true then, it's also true now. Most of the folks in the room are not from Putnam County, okay? And also that's a deal. So it's my indeed pleasure to introduce Miss Dr. Dorinda Dallmeyer to you. Dorinda has been here. She was the president of the Bartram Trail Conference when we had the conference here in 2015, and she's still the president of the Bartram Trail Conference as it is right now. And so, and she's a really good friend of mine, and she is a wonderful person. But the thing that she has to talk to us about is Mr. Bartram. She has captured his essence, and especially in the film Cultivating the Wild. There's the brochures over here that'll tell you how you get to it, and anybody can watch it and so forth. And at our last symposium, actually that was the closing act in our last symposium, was viewing the Cultivating the Wild. So, Ms. Dorinda, thanks for coming again. We love you and we thank you for being here.
The last session is, we're calling our Energizer Bunny behind his back, because that's just the way he is. And he's certainly been a great friend to everyone in the Bartram Trail Conference, as well as a dear friend of mine. So, Sam had asked me if I would talk about the film Cultivating the Wild. It's, he was talking about little brochures, so it's just a little card, but you can use it for bookmark in your copy of travel. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is this new way that we found to get the Bartram story out there in a way that we think will help us as we move toward beginning next year to celebrate our semi-quincentennial. So everybody say that together. Semi-quincentennial. It's 250 years that began with his arrival in the Southeast in 1773. And so if you just looked at this map, if you didn't know anything about William Bartram, you would know that an event that covered this much ground in the Southeast would be worthy of a documentary film. And we know that he was here for almost 4 years, from the summer of 1773 until he returned to his home near Philadelphia in early 1777. But just look at the ground he covered, all the way from the North Carolina Blue Ridge, the coast of Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida, all the way to the western shore of the Mississippi River. He had been here with his father in 1765 and 66, as you all know, since he had a brief connection with attempting agriculture in Florida before he left and went back home. But he wanted to come back, and he wanted to see more. He wanted to see not only places that they had been together, but to explore new ground. And so this, I think, makes him an interesting person, and the fact that he left us this documentary record only makes someone like me want to read more. It's like, where is there more that he wrote about this? And we know the travels very well. Probably all of you have seen it, read it. We were just looking at something last night that showed the travels of all things. I couldn't believe it was on television. But this whole idea of spending 3.5, 4 years in the South and then going back, and finally in 1791, after the American Revolution intervened, having the travels come out, and it's hardly been out of print since then. One of the things that he went to the South for was marching orders from his patron Dr. Fothergill to discover new plants that could be put into the transatlantic nursery trade. That's what his family did. One of these includes the oak-leaf hydrangea. How many of you have oak-leaf hydrangea in your yard? All right. Found just west of where I grew up in Macon, Georgia, and found in botanical gardens all around the world. I found it as far away as China in their collection. And then also the next plant that he was able to find on his journey was the Franklinia. This is Bartram's drawing of a Franklinia. It always looks so overblown to me, overdone, but then I finally got to see one in bloom and smell the fragrance, which is what you don't get from the illustration. If you ever have a chance to see one in bloom, you'll have to probably go to a botanical garden to see one that have not been seen along the Altamaha River where they came from since the mid-1840s. But if you ever get a chance to see one in bloom, please do. It's just an amazing plant. And finally, once I saw one, I knew why I was so fascinated with it. He also was interested in everything around him, not just plants. Among the 23 animals he's credited with being the first to write a scientific description of them are our beloved tail rabbit, and then of course the black vulture. All of these arrayed waiting for something to happen with this poor dead alligator beneath or here in Florida. In addition to that, of course, he was so closely allied with the native peoples he crossed paths with, the Cherokees, the Creeks, and of course here in Florida, the Seminoles. The only image of a person that appears in Travels is this image that he did of the Lone Warrior, the King of the Seminoles. And I like to think of Bartram like an embedded journalist that we see on TV today, someone who was so intimately entwined with the lifeways of the different nations with whom he visited, and leaving us such extensive detail about everything, how they governed themselves, their family structures, what they wore, what they ate. So there's something in Travels for everyone. So when I go out kayaking, I've done a lot of kayaking on Georgia rivers, about 1,000 miles. We have plenty of rivers, and I always take a laminated portrait, the peel portrait of William Bartram, strapped down out of the kayak. People paddle by and they'll stop and they say, "Why do you have a picture of Thomas Jefferson?" And so that gives me a great opportunity to proselytize and tell them about Bartram. And he had a connection with the river we happen to be on to tell them what he had to say about it. So I actually go out on the water and try to win new fans for William Bartram. I grew up, as I said, in Macon, Georgia. The house I grew up in was less than a mile from his path as he went westward to go all the way to the Mississippi and his return. back up that Indian trail with those traders. So I grew up knowing about William Bartram because of his proximity to where I grew up, and also because my father was a voracious consumer of history books. And now that I live in north of Athens, the home where I have lived for the last 45 years is less than 2 miles from the path he traced in 1773 with the surveyors who were marking out the boundaries of the new purchase, the lands, the 1.2 million acres of land that had been swapped by the Creeks and the Cherokees to wipe out their debts to the British. So I am very much invested in it. This book, Bartram's Living Legacy, The Travels and the Nature of the South, was published first in 2010 by Mercer University Press. Mark Jolly, their director, asked me, they wanted to come out with a new issue, they wanted to issue, reprint travels, but they didn't want it just to be travels. You can read travels on the web. So they asked me if I could put together some Southern nature writers who might be interested in contributing to this book. And the next time they turned around, I had 17 people lined up to write essays, not only writers, but artists, scientists, who wanted to tell their story of why someone who had lived nearly 250 years before they were doing their work meant so much to them. So we'll go to the next slide. This is Eric Breitenbach. Eric is retired from the faculty at Daytona State. He came down in the early 80s to begin teaching film studies there. He didn't know anything about North Florida, and someone told him, if you will get a copy of Bartram's Travels and read that, then that'll tell you what this place used to look like. And so he kept a copy of Travels in the glove compartment of his car, and every time he went out, he would read some. And so Bartram became his field guide for North Florida, his personal guide. And he also was fascinated with his story. And so he kept a file of Bartram articles over the years because he said, Eric makes documentaries. And he kept thinking for years and years this would be such a good documentary about this person. He had come across the book that I was just showing to you. And he contacted me in late 2016 and asked if he could talk to me, come to Athens and talk to me about doing a film. And I said, sure, why not? Come on over. And we had a long conversation over lunch and talked about, and of course I had time to think about it and what would I put in a film. And we came to an agreement that we would pursue putting together this documentary. And our vision was not going to be a stepwise, like, or an obituary for William Bartram. He was born here, he did this, on and on and on, but rather to talk about these modern day Bartrams, these people who were so inspired by what William Bartram had to say to them. And another piece of the fascination and the lure was his film school friend. They were in film school together in New York, and Scott Auerbach is a commercial videographer in Atlanta, so that made him handy. He's worked on documentaries, he does commercials as well, but his work has received Emmy Awards. So Scott was willing to come along on what would turn out to be take us almost as long as it took William Bartram in the South to get it onto the screen. So we were ready to go. And then the next thing was to choose our modern day Bartrams. And so that's why it's good to have friends. It was very easy for me to come up with people I knew could really talk about Bartram. And so we'll go to the next one. The first one is Janice Ray. Many of you may have heard her speak. She writes about Georgia, but also about North Florida. A distinguished Southern nature writer and a member of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, and we've been collaborating on various projects for about going on 25 years. The next one is Drew Lanham. He's a PhD ornithologist and a professor of wildlife ecology at Clemson. Also a great nature writer. His book, The Home Place Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature, was one of the finalists for the Burroughs Award in Nature Writing a couple of years ago. He not only writes prose, but also a great poet and a great soul. And then among the Bartrams is Philip Juris. Philip, I believe, has been down here and probably spoken before for you. He has a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Painting and Drawing from the University of Georgia, and also a Master of Landscape Architecture, because he was very interested in what the southern grasslands in particular used to look like. Because if you read Bartram, he talks about this. And you would never know. We don't think about places in the South that way. Philip was introduced to Bartram by his mother, by Philip's mother, when he was a young teen, and it really told him a lot about what Augusta, the area where he grew up, looked like. And so he uses Bartram as a way to get into the landscape and to travel across the landscape. He's had a series of exhibitions, but his one that was really focused on Bartram was the Southern Frontier, where he recreates the landscapes that Bartram saw that inspired Bartram's works. And then finally, my fourth modern day Bartram is James Holland. He left his home, left school before he graduated in Cochran, Georgia, joined the Marines, and then came back to Georgia to be a crabber. When he realized that the crab fishery was crashing, he wanted to know why, and he realized people were telling him about the coastal pollution problems. He sort of became, with the assistance of a lot of people, became a very good freshwater and saltwater biologist, and then served as the Altamaha River keeper for 10 years. And while James was going up and down the river with his camera, taking photographs of illegal outfalls and trash in the river, he began to photograph the beautiful things that he saw. And so Janice and I have worked with him on this book that spotlights his photographs of the Altamaha from its formation from Oconee and the Mulvey merging 136 miles down to the sea. Well, Eric had some friends too. And so our next one is someone you all are very familiar with up there at the top, Jim Sawgrass. I pulled up on the other day at the park, and a band pulled up, and out stepped Jim Sawgrass in complete regalia with a tomahawk, and I said, where else but Palatka could you see something? Dear Jim, as you know, talks so much about all the skills that the native peoples had, their customs, and he's been such a resource for people to learn more about the people who used to be the ones in charge of the landscape here. And then finally down below, Wayne Hartley, who for over 30 years has studied and reported the manatees that visit Blue Spring in such profusion, maybe not so much this year. But Blue Spring was such an important place for William Bartram. He was totally fascinated by the springs, the clarity of it, and then to actually be able to use the footage of Blue Springs was offered to us by the Save the Manatee group, gave us that kind of access to those kind of pictures that you don't see from the boardwalk. All right, so we know what William looked like. He looked a lot like Mike. Where did Mike go? So the question was, are we going to have Bartram in the film? And as you can see, there are more people in the world who portray William Bartram. And we decided that there was only that one image of him, that one painting of him, done when he was an older man, very old. Actually done over breakfast, if you can believe that. Someone just sat there and made an oil sketch while he was breakfast. Charles Wilson did. So we said, no. The important thing about William were his words. And so Eric had another contact, Tom Nowicki. I did not know him until after the fact what an extensive resume he has in television, movies, on the stage. And so Tom became the voice of William Bartram. And if you have not seen the film or heard the film, you'll hear Tom. He has that beautiful Yale Drama School diction, and he was so meticulous, he wanted to know exactly how to pronounce all the scientific names correctly the first time. I told him that every time I open up Bartram now, I hear his voice. And he said he wished that every time he opened his mouth, he was as eloquent as William Bartram. And then finally, our narrator, Betty White, who also has this unmistakable voice from her years of reading on NPR and all of her wonderful books of fact and fiction about Southwest Georgia, where she grew up. Also a friend of Eric's. So he has all kinds of friends, and so do I, and we're glad to be able to put them all together, along with Mary Cuccetti, who composed the soundtrack for it. So, we had the big thing was you have to raise money to make a film. And I had some contacts with foundations. Obviously, the Bartram Trail Conference helped support us generously. With the Wormslow Foundation, the Bible League Foundation, the offices of the Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina Nature Conservancy helped move this project along. And then we had a Kickstarter. And we were on tenterhooks, wondering if we were going to meet our $30,000 goal. And actually, as you can see, we exceeded it. But we also had contributions from people we didn't know who would respond, and that was descendants of the Bartram family, as well as a gentleman from India. And we have no idea why he was interested in Bartram, but Bartram had reached way beyond Putnam County, apparently. So we had our money in the pocket, and we were ready to go over to Little St. Simon's to do our first shoot. There's Eric, his former student Cameron Kirshner, who was going to do drone work for us. Steve Sobel with his back to me. The enormous camera is responsible for so many of the gorgeous bird images that you see in the film. And nobody had been to Little St. Simon's except for me, but I knew where our work was. So, if you think, this is what we think of when we think of a movie set, right? You've got set, you've got people with director's chairs, and then hollering things, and clapping clapboards, and all like that. That's not how you do a nature documentary. You're not on a sound stage, you're not on a set, and you don't have a script. And so this is what it looks like to make a documentary. Here we are on the beach at Little St. Simon. On your left is Drew Lanham. He's got his spotting scope there, but he's down on his knees taking pictures of seashells and bird footprints. Scott is standing in the dark coat filming him. Scott Ferguson was there to help haul things around, and then there's Eric on his knees filming him from that angle. And the sound is on, and Drew's talking, and things are going on. And my job at that time was to stay out of the frame. And that's really hard when you're on a 7.5 mile long deserted beach. So I figured out how to do it, was just walk behind them. If they were walking, I stayed behind them. If I could see their backs, that was all right. So we were just going along, and Drew would stop, for example, look at birds and talk about the birds he saw, and that everybody would be filming what was going on. And the beauty of what we were doing was it was all digital. It didn't involve film. It didn't involve having to develop it. All you had to do was have hard drives that would hold terabytes of information. So our next was a little bit even more confined, being in a boat, unless you're going to be towed behind on the road. But here's Cameron about to release the drone. If we tried to do this 25 years ago, we would have had to have rented a helicopter to get all those aerial views out of the marsh. And yet we have someone who's using his own equipment, which granted is not inexpensive, but we knew what he was doing and he could provide us with that bird's eye view that was so important when you're talking about landscapes that Bartram was describing. Now, one thing I learned is that people who make films like to get up early in the morning because of the light. And that is not my normal habit. But this looks like it was taken on another planet. But what it is, we were at, how many have been to the marshes of Glen Overlook up at Brunswick? Right? Some of you probably have stopped or you've looked at it as you've gone by. This was at sunrise at low tide. And it's just absolutely magical. So that was worth getting up for. And then we go out later that day with James, someone who knows the Ultima Hall like the back of his hand. He takes us out to these places, and again, trying to stay out of the frame, everybody filming and really enjoying themselves because they had never seen this before. They just want to take everything in. And you see these spontaneous appearances of beauty, like these egrets warming up in the morning sun by the river, and then the opposite end of it, where you see two really awful places we visited, probably the worst places we visited in the whole film. The outfall from the pulp mill in Brunswick, where they release all this effluent, and then up which I spared you the images of the outfall from the Brunswick sewage treatment plant. So we got it all. We weren't trying to prettify and paint over how different it is today than anything that Bartram would have ever seen or probably imagined at the time. So we weren't always outdoors. We did film at the Georgia Museum of Natural History, the collection at the University of Georgia, with another friend of mine, Bud Freeman, who's the director there. And there we had Drew at the museum looking at bird skins in the collection. And so it happened that Bud and Drew were pulling out drawers and closing them, and pulling out drawers and closing them. And we got down to one that had a Bachman's warbler, several specimens of Bachman's warblers in there. And Drew started talking about how they probably never were very abundant, but they're now extinct. They're in South Carolina and the Georgia coastal zone. And so he started to talk about the bird, and Eric said, wait a minute, sit down and talk about the bird. And so we got this footage of Drew that comes at the very end, toward the end of the film, talking about the losses that we've experienced here in the Southeast. I think, it's one thing that usually makes people cry, and I'm sorry for that, but it's fact. So then the next point that we went to, the guys got to go down and film a prescribed burn at Movie Forest. They had to learn how to wear fireproof clothing and film around fire. And then the next was to go here. Another early morning, getting up in the morning in the dark in Athens, and getting in the car and driving out east of Athens to Broad River to see this spot that Philip had painted, to see the rocky shoals spider lilies in bloom. And we get there, and we're in the middle of nowhere, we go through the woods with flashlights, and get down to the river, and it opens up, and then we see this. And I just absolutely burst into tears. It was just stunning to see this. You see all the vapor coming up off the shoals, and we just spent the whole morning with it. You couldn't tear yourself away from it. And then Scott had to work, and he was out there desperately walking around on these uneven rocks on the bottom and trying not to baptize his expensive So we'll move on here. You always have people who want to offer assistance. This is Azalea. This is Janice's pet cow, helping Eric out with his f-stops and all of that. And then Eric was fixated on seeing this tree along the bottom. He'd seen this photograph. This is a cypress that's 45 feet circumference. And this became like the Holy Grail or Shangri-La better for Eric, because he would call up and he'd say, can we go see the tree? And I'd call James and he'd say, no, the river's too high, we can't get there. Can we go see the tree? No, it's hunting season. The deer hunters will kill us all. So finally, almost the last thing that Eric shot was up there. Got to go, but then of course any of you who've been on sand roads know what that's like. They used the drone to go find someone. And the Jeep who pulled them out, and so finally Eric got to stand there and touch the tree, and that was how that worked. Finally, so now the cutting room floor. If you've got terabytes of footage, you just can never look at all of it. So there had been some preliminary edits along the way over the course of the years as they're ticking off, and Eric had tried out some shorter. But there is just so much good stuff that is not in this film. So, you can't, it's like trying to choose among your children. So, we sat down together in August of 2019 in Atlanta, in Scott's house, sat there for 3 solid days, hardly moving. I didn't think I would ever walk correctly. And produced the final cut. And then we debuted it in Montgomery at the Barton Crow Conference. Then debuted it, or premiered it in Daytona at this wonderful theater that they have at Daytona State. through the end of January 2020, and then it's coronavirus time. So all the theaters, there was no way that we were going to be able to do theatrical presentations of this film because of the lockdown. We had always intended that it would be offered for public television. Fortunately, we were able to partner with South Carolina Educational TV. They have a national reputation for really great programming, for doing, debuting new things, doing new series. And so they made it possible for us to offer it to all of the PBS affiliates across the country and to the members of the National Educational Television Association, which includes schools and libraries and other entities. And so that went up on in November, and that's what the opening vision of it looks like. So we were, you know, it was really something. It aired in Georgia right before Thanksgiving. It was like Thanksgiving Eve, and I didn't know it was on Georgia Public Broadcasting until the day after. So we go. It was this map shows all the places it's been shown in the United States. This is not necessarily complete. The solid states it's been shown on statewide affiliates. The dots represent individual stations or regional stations, but it's been seen in New York, and Boston, and Los Angeles, and San Francisco, all of, even Alaska. I don't know what people in Idaho make out of Bartram or whatever. A lot of places that Bartram never got to go to. And certainly not even maybe thought about Alaska. So the next thing I want to say is, over there on the table are these little cards that have the address on the back. You just go to pbs.org, and put in Cultivating the Wild in the search box, and it'll take you right to it. And you can watch it 24 hours a day. Anytime you want to watch it, it'll be up there. And so I hope that if you haven't seen it, you'll watch it. If you've seen it, watch it again now that you know a little bit more about the backstory for it. And as I said, I'm so impressed with everything that you all are doing throughout the St. John's watershed to bring Bartram back to the core, to really focus on the environmental heritage, the environmental history that you have here. You've set such a high bar for all the rest of the people on the Bartram Trail. But I hope to see you again somewhere, even if it's in Baton Rouge, on the Bartram Trail. Thank you very much.